Hello, and welcome to First English, and also welcome to our IELTS video series here. My name is Daniel, and in these videos, we're going to be covering a lot of the tips, the tricks, the tools, and most of the things that you're going to need to know about preparing for your IELTS exam. So whether you've taken the exam before or you're preparing for your first time, we're really going to be breaking down just about all that you need to know to achieve that band or to achieve that band that you're aiming for. So let's go ahead and get started. So first up, the first thing that I'd like to cover or mention with you guys here is I would just like to talk about the assessment criteria. A lot of students going into the IELTS exam unfortunately haven't really seen this and aren't really aware what they're going to be graded on specifically. So first and foremost, I'd like to cover this with you. I think most individuals preparing for the exam are going to be aiming for about a 7, which is a good middle ground to attempt to achieve for yourself. It's a very attainable and doable position to strive for. So there are 4 assessment criteria in the speaking portion of the exam particularly. I'm going to be covering all 4 of them today and breaking them down pretty in-depthly, but I'm going to speak about them in a little synopsis right now with you. So first up, we have fluency and coherence. This consists, or the grading at least, the criteria to achieve a band 7 in fluency and coherence consists of 3 main points. First of which being can speak at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. The point number 2 is may demonstrate language-related hesitation at times or some repetition and or self-correction. And then number 3, the last point in fluency and coherence is uses a range of connective and discourse markers with some flexibility. So first up, the thing I'd like to mention already here is that even in attaining a band 7, or if that's what your attempted or targeted band is going to be, which is typically what's required of those of you who want to study abroad or work abroad or even immigrate in the IELTS related countries that require this exam. You're not going to be required to perform perfectly during the exam. Obviously, everybody makes mistakes, even native speakers, when they're having general conversation. So the examiner isn't going to be looking for you to have, again, a perfect performance in your exam. There is a little bit of leeway, a little bit of wiggle room in terms of your answers and your delivery and your articulation. So don't be too afraid. Don't lack the confidence to go into the exam with a full head of steam and do as best you can. Um, Even if you make a couple mistakes, you definitely can still achieve a band 7. So moving on to the next criteria or category, we have lexical resource. So the 3 points included there are uses vocabulary resource flexibly to discuss a variety of topics. Point number 2 is uses some less common and idiomatic vocabulary and shows some awareness of style and collocation with some appropriate or inappropriate choices. Again, showing a little bit of flexibility. We're not looking for you to be perfect to attain this 7. Um, and then uses paraphrasing effectively is the last point mentioned there for lexical resource. And then the third category here, which is grammatical range and accuracy. There are only 2 points mentioned for a band 7. First being uses a range of complex structures with some flexibility. And then the last point or second point is frequently produces error-free sentences, though some grammatical mistakes persist. And then lastly, the last category, which is pronunciation, I'm actually going to read the band 8 here because band 7 actually relates very much to band 8. But to attain a band 8 in pronunciation, you're looking for these 3 points. Uses a wide range of pronunciation features. Number 2 is sustains flexible use of features with only occasional lapses. And then the last point is it's easy to understand throughout. Accent has minimal effect on intelligibility. So there you have it. You already understand a bit of what is expected of you to attain these bands in which you're going to be graded on for the IELTS exam. And now I'm going to break down each and every one of these categories so we can perfectly well understand exactly what you're going to need to do to achieve that band 7 or higher. So let's jump into it here. So the first assessment criteria that we mentioned there, fluency and coherence. So fluency and coherence, it refers or relates to your ability to speak at length, including your organization or the organization of your ideas. Obviously, we need that to be logical and you need to be able to indulge and use the appropriate signposting. And what signposting is it refers to your ability to express and justify your opinions, analyze and discuss, speculate your issues or the issues in your answers without long pauses or repetition of the same amounts of words. So let me speak about that a little bit at length to break it down a bit further for you. Um, so essentially, coherence, the definition of the word coherence means the quality of being logical and consistent. So that's the name of the game here to achieve the right kind of score in this category. So let's say, for example, I'll use some examples here because really that's the best way to fully understand and get a grasp of what's expected of you to achieve a high mark in fluency coherence, or at least this assessment criteria. Let's say someone was to ask you, for example, what's the weather today? Now, generally, typically what people would answer, or how people would answer that is they would say something short and sweet like, it's raining. It's raining outside. Now, this answer in and of itself is a perfectly acceptable answer in terms of a conversational scenario, right? It's short, it's sweet, it gets to the point, it answers the question. But remember, with fluency coherence, we want to exemplify your ability to speak at length and organize your thoughts logically and appropriately. We need to show that you can use complex sentences and integrate your ideas and organize your thoughts in those complex sentences coherently and fluently, obviously. So, of that mindset or maintaining that mindset, a more appropriate answer in terms of the IELTS expectation for fluency and coherence is if you were to be asked, what's the weather today? You would more appropriately want to answer with something like, I would like to point out that it is in fact raining at this time. So it says the exact same thing. Those two sentences obviously have the exact same definition as each other, but the second is just a tad more complex. Right? We have a bit of a transition or introduction at the beginning with a bit of transition into our main point or the main idea of that sentence. And this is the kind of answering or sentence structure that we need to follow in the articulation of your answers at any point in the exam, whether it be in part one, part two, part three. And what we're going to do in later videos is actually break down the question types involved in each part of the exam, the speaking portion of the exam, and really go into the specific structures that are going to be suggested to be used to answer the questions correctly in terms of fluency and coherence, get that correct structure and a nice complex sentence organization to achieve a high band and a high mark in this particular criteria. So let me exemplify another example here. Let's say, for example, someone was to ask you, when did World War II start? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not too much of a history whiz. So in most cases, people would usually say, I don't know. Or even if you did know, you might say something like, I think in 1940. Right? That would again usually be the short and sweet kind of answer that people would typically give in a conversational sense. Now, again, going back to the mentality that we need to keep, or the structure that we want to kind of um, articulate all our answers in any portion, any point of the IELTS exam, we would much rather say something like, let me just pull up this answer here and copy and paste it. I prepared this, and I just need to copy and paste it to save time instead of me typing out everything. Um, but here you go. You want to preferably say something like, well, to tell you honestly, I'm not very good in history, but if I was to guess, I believe it must have been around the year 1940. Again, these two answers, these two sentences say is essentially the exact same thing. But the second answer again exemplifies exactly how you want to structure or articulate your responses in your answers to the IELTS exam. All right, we want to make nice, complex, almost long-winded sentences. And the struggle that people have, I've noticed, um, in terms of kind of adopting this structure, this manner of speaking, is it's not typically how people verbally communicate, especially in friendly kind of nonchalant conversations. If you were speaking to a friend of yours and he asked you, for whatever the odd reason is, when did World War II start? You probably wouldn't answer in kind of a long-winded fashion like this. But this is what we need to essentially pound into your brain. And this is the kind of manner in which you need to get comfortable presenting your thoughts, your ideas, your responses to the answers so we can maintain and achieve a high mark in fluency and coherence. Okay. So this is going to include the appropriate linking phrases, the inclusion of redundant language, um, and don't be alarmed if you don't fully comprehend what's going on at this point in terms of fluency and coherence, because we're going to break down each and every question type with a particular structure that you can follow to achieve the kind of complex sentence structure that we're looking for with each and every one of your answers. So moving forward, kind of reiterating what I said earlier, appropriate signposting is also very important to maintain throughout your answers that you provide in the IELTS exam. And what signposting means is there's a little example here. I know it's a bit small and difficult to read, but what signposting is going to do is it's going to help the listener, or in this case, the examiner, the individual listening to the answers that you're going to give in the exam. They're going to help you, the signposting is going to help them follow along with your responses. It's going to help them understand where you're taking your answers, because we want to make things complex, a little long-winded and so on, but we don't want to lose the examiner or the individual listening to us. We want them to be able to follow along nice and coherently in a very logical manner. We need to present our answers in a very logical method and way. So signposting is really um, the inclusion of the linking phrases and transitional statements in your answer, which direct each of your points, each of your reasons, and each of the evidences, the pieces of evidence that you're going to use, essentially, in the answers that you provide. So a little example I've put together here is, like this is an example of signposting, essentially. Well, to answer your question, I would like to first point out that, blah, 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 and the fact is also attributed to, blah, blah, blah. Now moving on to another pertinent detail, that fact being, so on and so forth, notably also related to the idea that, blah, blah, blah. And lastly, I would like to mention that, so on and so forth. You can see each and every one of those phrases directs the next part of my answer, the next thing I'm going to say. It connects it with the previous part, and it helps our entire answer kind of come together and flow very, very nicely. So again, maintaining that kind of structure is what we're looking for in terms of fluency and coherence. We're going to want to maintain a nice, complex, I know I keep repeating the exact same phrases, but we need to get you aware and motivated to speak in this kind of manner, because it's not necessarily as natural as some people um, would like to think. But in any case, each structure is going to be broken down in later videos for each question type, so stick around for that. Moving forward though, the next assessment criteria, the second one in that grid, is lexical resource. So here we're going to talk about how we can achieve a 7. So lexical resource essentially means vocabulary, the vocabulary range, the vocabulary complexity, and the word choice in which you employ in your answers. So we've broken it down into a couple main factors or facets that you want to contribute in your answers here pertaining to lexical resource. So the first is collocation. So collocation essentially relates to using the correct words together. Like the examples that are listed here is, you do your homework, you don't action your homework. Who would do that, right? Or a lion would roar, a lion doesn't shout. I think you get the idea. But to give you a little bit further examples, I'll write them down here just so we have them nice and included if you're taking notes. So for example, you would say something like, it is raining, or there is a heavy rain outside, right? You wouldn't say something like there is a big rain, right? That is incorrect. It'd be heavy rain versus big rain. Another example I have here would be, you could describe somebody as deep in thought. They wouldn't be far in thought. So I know this is hopefully for most of you, it's a pretty basic um, idea and a pretty well understood concept here. But for a lot of people, that might be a struggle. So just understand that connotation relates to the proper word placement in relation to the other words, usually adjectives, in some cases verbs and adverbs. But yes, hopefully that's well understood. Moving on to the next facet here, which is connotation. Now, connotation essentially relates to the feeling or association that each word has. Like, for example, some of the mentions here are the neutral word in this case. There's positive, neutral, and negative associations to these words. The neutral word is inactive, and then the negative word or the negative connotation to that would be lazy, and then laid back would be the positive. So as you can see, all three of these words essentially mean the exact same thing. Laid back, inactive, lazy, they all really mean the exact same thing. But I'm pretty sure all of us would much rather be called laid back than lazy, because laid back has a positive connotation, has a positive feeling and mentality associated to it, whereas lazy has the reverse, the negative, right? I think most of us would prefer to be called slim versus skinny, right? And thin is the neutral word in this case. A couple more examples that I have are as follows. We have, for a word with a positive connotation, we could say we're interested. For a neutral connotation, you could say a word like questioning. Interested in questioning essentially have the same meaning. And then a word or a synonym for these two with a negative connotation could be something like nosy. So do note that all of these words are, of course, synonyms. The only difference therein being that each of them have a slightly different feeling mentioned or associated subliminally around it or pertaining to it. So a couple other examples I have here are thrifty would be a positive connotation, right? Thrifty, somebody who saves money but quite well. And then the neutral would just be saving, right? And then the negative would be stingy. Stingy meaning thrifty and saving, but with that negative connotation. You don't really want to be called stingy. It means you're cheap. Some other examples here, just so you guys get a good idea of what we're talking about, would be steadfast. Steadfast has a nice positive outlook to it, nice positive connotation. A neutral connotation to that, or a neutral word, would be something like tenacious. Steadfast, tenacious, essentially meaning the exact same thing. Like I said, practically synonyms in this case, one just having a slightly different connotation. And then a negative word, or a word with that negative association, would be like stubborn. I'm sure we're well aware or know somebody who is stubborn or might be stubborn ourselves, but it is a word with a negative connotation. And I'll just do one last one here. Unique has a positive connotation. Different is neutral. And then lastly, we have peculiar. Peculiar. Just checking my spelling there. But yeah, that would have a negative connotation. So hopefully that's well understood. Moving on here, complex words. Complex words, I mean, are this is relatively self-explanatory, obviously. Not only should we be seeking complexity in our sentences, but we should also have direct complexity in our word choice, right, and our word usage. Um, in simpler words, if we have the opportunity to use words that are a bit more varied, a bit more interesting and colorful in place of words that we might typically use, which are a bit more basic or simple, we should obviously take it. We should take that opportunity to insert that more complex word. Now, we don't necessarily need to sound too illustrious or excessive, but we do want to sound nice and eloquent and collected when the opportunity is there. So complex words. Then uncommon words, to break that down a little bit, this is actually where your main focus should be in terms of lexical resource. And this is a big kind of factor that you're going to be judged upon or graded on by your examiner in terms of your answers, of course. But uncommon words essentially goes a step beyond complex words. And here we insist that you employ words which are topic specific, or related to a particular theme. So let me write that down for you. So uncommon words relate to topic specific, right? Or they relate to a certain theme. Relate or pertain. Now, I have some examples of this. In fact, we have some in our reading here, our material. So, yeah, we're talking about words that essentially can only be used in one context or in one situation, right? So, to also give you a little bit of contrast, instead of using words like magnificent and extravagant, although these are complex words and do have some opportunity for usage, at some point in our answers, if there's an opportunity to use a word which is specific to the topic at hand or specific to the theme in which you're answering to the question in which you're answering, you want to use it. So, for example, let's say you're answering a question about a city, or you're answering a question about um, a metropolis, right, or an urbanization. You want to use words like population, like congestion, like pollution, metropolis, so on and so forth. Some other examples I have here, which I'll write out for you, are, let's say, for example, we're speaking about photography or cameras. So you want to use words that relate and are specific to the topic of cameras and photography. You can use words um, use words like contrast, right? Like saturation. You can use words like depth, landscape, portrait, aperture, or exposure. These are all words which relate specifically to the field of photography and to the advanced settings of cameras and so on. And you really can't use these words outside of that context, if you understand. Another example is if you're talking about jobs or something that's work related. You want to use words then like employment, like faculty. You want to use words like attrition, occupation, tenure, items like that. Um, so if there is ever an opportunity for you to use an uncommon word in place of a more simple or even at times a complex word, obviously take it. Um, so on and so forth. So hopefully that's well understood. But the last thing I'd like to note here or mention um, in terms of lexical resource is paraphrasing. Now, obviously, when you're in the heat of the moment, when you're in the middle of your exam and your examiner is listening to your questions, is sitting there breathing down your neck, you might find it difficult to remember or recall or articulate some of these uncommon words, which you've thought or prepared on. So if that be the case, what you need to do is to paraphrase. And what paraphrasing is just taking the definition of the word or describing the word essentially. If you can take the definition of the word and input it to where the word should be in your answer, that is perfectly acceptable. And in fact, that adds a little bit more complexity to your sentence and to your answer. So it's definitely a good avenue to take. Again, if you might be drawing a blank and maybe don't fully comprehend or remember a particular word in which you wish to use, so on and so forth. So the example that I've prepared here is like, let's say we're speaking about photography and cameras, and we're trying to remember a word like depth or aperture or contrast or saturation. We could simply input where we would use that word contrast, something like the advanced setting which alters the look and the capture of photography or of photographs through a camera. Um, or other phrases like the particular setting which relates to the amount of color that's filtered into a photo. That's actually the definition of contrast, if you don't know. So you can use those opportunities to paraphrase and input the definitions or essentially the meanings of the words, which you can't quite recall, remember in your actual answers. It's a good skill to have, and it's something you can certainly rely upon when you're in the heat of the moment. In any case, moving forward to the following assessment criteria here, we have grammatical range and accuracy. So again, this should be pretty self-explanatory. Um, Obviously, we need to employ a wide range of grammatical tenses, grammatical range in your answers. Obviously, we need to keep your entire response, or we shouldn't keep your entire response in one tense. That's not what we're looking for. Instead, we're really going to try to take every opportunity to insert complex but accurate grammar structures. So this isn't going to be too difficult because frankly, the structure that we employ is really going to encourage you to implement various types of varied grammatical tenses and ranges in your answers. So again, the structure that we teach for each answer type or each question type, sorry, really sets up the framework for that varied grammar to be used. So don't fret too much if you don't aren't familiar with some of the structures and some of the tenses that are listed here. I'm not going to go through each one of them because you should be somewhat familiar with most of them. We have comparative structures, various conditional structures, modular verbs, perfect tense, different ways of talking about the future, so on and so forth. But another thing that I'd like to note here, like to mention, is that when restating or reiterating a previous part of your answer, which kind of ties into the redundant language, right, which helps adds complexity to your answer and so on. If you're ever restating something or reiterating something that you previously mentioned in your answer, take that opportunity to change the structure of or change the tense in which you produced your original statement or your original point of your answer. What I mean by that is, for example, let's say at some point in your answer you used a comparative structure and said something like, I like watching movies more than watching TV. What you could do then is, if maybe in the conclusion of your answer or just at some later point in your answer, or maybe even during the answer of a different question, you want to restate that same fact which you or that same statement which you made prior, you can change up the you can use a different tense essentially, or a different grammatical structure to convey that same message. So I'll write it out here for those of you taking notes. You can follow along. So let's say, for example, again, you said, I like watching movies more than watching TV. You could then say something like, I would rather watch a movie versus watching TV. Right? So that actually not only changes essentially the tense or the method of saying it, but that it completely changes the structure, because now this is a module auxiliary verb with the infinitive of watch in it. But again, I'm not going to explain that too in depthly here. That's not what this class, at least in particular, is about. But hopefully you can see what I mean. You can use the opportunities in just restating and using that redundant language, which is encouraged, to change up your grammar range, change up your grammar structure, and add that nice complexity to your sentences, and obviously achieve a high mark in the tier of grammatical range and accuracy. So what I'd like to do here is just take these opportunities or take these examples that are mentioned here in the textbook, and let me get this out of the way, and just show you some examples on how you can restate each of the examples here in the reading. So we have a various conditional structure example in, if we breathe too much carbon dioxide, we will increasingly find breathing difficult. So take a minute there and see if you can think of a way to maybe reiterate or rephrase that exact same statement. You could say something like, breathing will become increasingly difficult if we breathe more carbon dioxide. All right, so again, that's the same situation as the first example. Not only does it reiterate the exact same point, just in a different matter, adding that complexity, but it completely changes the grammatical structure. Sorry, I incorrectly spelled breathing there, obviously. But yeah, so first and foremost, this is the point I'm trying to make. Just taking the opportunity to restate some of the things that you said in previous, again, in the same answer or in previous answers will present the opportunity to add redundant language, complexity in your sentences, and nice grammatical range and accuracy. Of course, that's the key here, is we have to remain accurate. It's not always the case where you can simply flip around a sentence and it remains grammatically correct. Oftentimes, you will have to change the tense to a lot of the verbs, or include some adverbs, or uh, take out some articles, or alter the sentence in some way to make it accurate. So again, that's a key. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's go through a couple more examples here. We do have quite a bit of time. Um, so let's see here. This on a modular verb example. The second one here, we have many people think we should be doing more for the environment. Again, many people think we should be doing more for the environment. A further example of that, or a reiterated example, could be something like doing more for the environment is what many people think. Simple as that. That keeps it in a modular verb tense in that example. But again, that redundant language is also what we're looking for, adding that complexity. I know I keep restating it, but it's important for us to understand each and every one of these points, because maintaining all of these points in our answers are going to achieve us that 7, 7.5, maybe even an 8 if we can keep it consistent through all our answers, which is the goal. You want to aim high, of course, right? So let's do a couple more examples here before we move on. Um, let's do this one here. My country has developed skills in managing diplomatic relations. Let me just toss this out of the way. So my country has developed skills in managing sensitive diplomatic relations. So one way we could restate that, and I hope if you're following along, you're trying this on your own as well, giving you plenty of time before I give you my answer. But my answer is managing sensitive diplomatic relations is a skill my country has, let me put it over here, developed. Right? So again, that keeps it in the perfect tense as well. We didn't have to do too much to change it around. We essentially just flipped the sentence over um, and set it as that. But yeah, it's a perfect example on how to do what I keep reiterating or keep mentioning. It's the reiteration of your points in your answers, um, while, of course, changing up grammatical tenses when the opportunity presents itself. So cool. Let's move on to the last bit here, because we are running at a little bit of time. But lastly, we have the last assessment criteria, which is pronunciation. So pronunciation is probably the most straightforward and self-explanatory criteria out of all of um, the criteria or categories in which you're going to be graded on. Obviously, this relates to the individual sounds and the syllables and the stresses and the letters and how you pronounce each and every word. So to be completely frank, it's going to be um, a difficult thing to work on for some people, but there are certain points in pronunciation, even if you struggle with pronunciation as a whole, there are certain areas where you can score high in, and I'm going to show you those right now. Even if you have difficulty in particular pronunciations, maybe you have a thicker accent, which will be a little bit harder to break, especially if we have a short amount of time together. But there are some opportunities for even those who struggle somewhat in pronunciation um, to make some good games in terms of scoring and the band you reach with this particular criteria. So it's also mentioned here, word stress is also obviously something that pertains very much to pronunciation. We want to be able to provide the right stress in the right syllable of particular words. The examples here are, we say mistake, not mistake, right? The stress is in the second syllable, steak, mistake. Here we have the second syllable in democracy being the stressed as well. We have democracy, right? It's a little bit sharper, that syllable in the middle there. So it's quite subtle, but it is something to note, right? And if you have the ability to pronounce that as fluently as a native speaker, it's only going to count in your stead. But this third point here is, like I mentioned, where you can make up um, for maybe some lost points in the pronunciation category if it isn't necessarily your strong suit. So sentence stress is crucial when you're trying to convey a particular point, or emphasizing a particular point in a sentence can essentially change its entire meaning. And let me show you what I mean by that. Let me write out this sentence. She said, or no, sorry. I never said she stole your money. So this is a pretty basic sentence, right? But watch how stressing each word changes the meaning of the sentence entirely. I never said she stole your money. 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 So notice how that was a little exuberant, I'll admit. Hopefully that made some of you giggle. Um, but notice how by stressing each one of those words differently in each time you say that sentence, it completely changes the meaning of said sentence. So that's the idea, or that's the point behind sentence stress, is by stressing particular points in particular sentences or particular words in a sentence, you can change or alter the meaning of it substantially. So keep that in mind. Obviously, it's not an opportunity that presents itself in every single sentence that you write, but it is an opportunity there to receive some marks in pronunciation if it's used correctly, right? And we'll break down, I mean, in further classes, obviously, we'll take the opportunity to go through some answers together. We'll allow you, if you have one-on-one sessions with us, to compose some answers with a tutor, and we'll take the opportunity to address and point out things like this, point out areas and opportunities to implement this kind of note or this kind of facet of pronunciation in your answers. So intonation is the next point that I would like to mention. Intonation is also very important. Intonation is the tone and the change of pitch in which you speak and articulate um, and verbalize essentially the words and the sentences that you create. The key there is we don't want you to sound too monotone during the entire exam, right? That would be boring for you and boring for the examiner, and ultimately it's going to lose you marks. So it's not something that we necessarily encourage or want you to abide by or stick to. So definitely take the opportunity to change intonation depending on the situation and how you're composing your answer, what you're intending to say. Um, you can notice how intonation changes when questions are asked or when statements are made, for example, um, so on and so forth. And then the last bit here is chunking. Chunking is essentially the rhythm in which one delivers chunks of words and overall their entire sentence articulation. So chunking is a good thing to keep in mind, especially if you're prone to speaking too fast, getting ahead of yourself, stumbling over your words. So for example, a sentence we have here is, today I'd like to discuss a key topic for managers, the one elusive ingredient that staff manages. So that sentence is a little bit hard to follow, especially if you're one to read it too fast. So instead, we can just break up the words by going, today I'd like to discuss a key topic for managers, the one elusive ingredient that staff manages. So it's a very good tool and kind of exercise, again, for those who purposely or not end up speaking too fast in their answers, because obviously there's some negative connotations to speaking too fast. You can get tripped up. You can maybe lose your thought process or your train of thought, and obviously get marked down for that. You might mispronounce word, which will get you marked down for pronunciation. So if you have a tendency of doing that, focus on chunking your answers and kind of splitting up your sentences just to help you convey um, your sentences in a nice, clean, articulate, and well put together manner. If that makes sense. Um, yeah. I won't go any further into that. But that essentially leaves us to the next bits here, which we're actually going to be covering in later videos. Again, we're going to be covering the question types to all three parts of the speaking portion of the IELTS exam. Um, as you can see, the first question type we have are basic description questions. So we'll be covering that later on. So thank you for making it this far with me. I hope you got a little bit of that and it helped you get a good idea as to what to expect in terms of the grading, in terms of the assessment criteria, and how to score or how to achieve the band that you're aiming for, what's expected of you, and how to conduct yourself in the exam. Um, Later on, we're going to cover the structures of some question types and all three portions, all three parts of the exam. And I hope you can join me for those. But thank you very much for your time. Again, this has been First English, and you have a great day.